A Mafia boss walked into a roadside diner and jokingly told the waitress, "Come with me." She said okay before he could finish. He thought it was bold. He had no idea. She'd been waiting for that exact moment. The diner had no name worth remembering, just a faded sign, a buzzing neon light that kept blinking like it couldn't decide whether to stay on or give up, and a parking lot cracked so badly the weeds had won years ago. The kind of place that existed between destinations. Not a stop anyone planned, just a place people ended up when they were running from something or driving through nothing. At 11:43 p.m., 3 black SUVs rolled off the highway and into that parking lot like shadows that had learned to move in formation. Inside the diner, 4 people sat spread across different booths. A trucker nursing black coffee, an elderly couple sharing pie, a teenager asleep against the window. None of them looked up when the door opened. But Emily Carter did. She always did. She was already moving before the first man stepped through, reaching for the coffee pot, pulling a clean rag from her apron pocket, straightening the laminated menus in the rack by the register. Not because she was nervous, because she was ready. 3 men entered first, their eyes sweeping the room the way eyes do when checking for exits rather than seats. Then came the 4th man. He wasn't the biggest, wasn't the loudest. He didn't need to be either of those things. Marcus Hale walked into the diner the same way a storm front moves across open sky, quietly, completely, and in a way that made everything else feel slightly less significant. He was mid-40s, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket that was too expensive for the zip code. His jaw was set, and his eyes were the kind of tired that had nothing to do with sleep. He slid into the corner booth without looking at the menu. His men took positions, one by the door, one at the counter, one stood near the restroom hallway. Textbook. Automatic, like breathing. Emily walked over. "Coffee?" she asked. Marcus looked up. Most people, even people who didn't know exactly who he was, looked away from him quickly, like eye contact might cost them something. This woman held his gaze like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Black," he said. She poured without measuring, set the cup down without spilling a drop, and walked back to the counter. He watched her go. She didn't walk like someone who spent her nights taking orders in a forgotten diner on a Nevada highway. She walked like someone who had decided, very deliberately, to be here. When she came back to take his food order, he studied her the way he studied everything, quickly, thoroughly, filing away details. Mid-30s, no ring, no name tag, just habit, hair pulled back, hands steady, eyes that moved across the room every 40 seconds, clocking the door, clocking his men, clocking him. She wasn't afraid. That was the strange part. Everyone was afraid of Marcus Hale. Fear was efficient. It saved time. But this woman, this nobody waitress in a diner between nowhere and nothing, looked at him like he was just a man who'd ordered black coffee. He found it irritating, then amusing. "You're not going to ask why 4 men in suits stopped at a diner at midnight?" he said when she brought his food. Emily set the plate down. "Not my business." Smart. "Hungry people want food," she said, "not conversation." He almost smiled. Almost. He ate in silence. His men stayed alert. The trucker left. The old couple paid their bill and shuffled out. The teenager kept sleeping. Emily wiped the counter, refilled the salt shakers, checked the clock. She had 40 minutes left on her shift. She had $47 in tips for the night. She had a 2009 Civic in the parking lot with a check engine light that had been on for 3 months. Marcus finished eating, pushed the plate aside, looked at her again. She was already looking back. And something about that, something about the complete absence of fear, the quiet intelligence sitting behind those steady eyes, made him say what he said next. Not seriously, not as an actual offer, just to see what would happen. Just to crack that calm exterior and see what fell out. "Come with me," he said, a half smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. I could use someone who… Okay. He stopped. The word had come out before he'd finished his sentence. No hesitation, no nervous laugh. No, what do you mean? Or are you serious? Just, okay. Flat. Certain. Like she'd been waiting for the question. Emily untied her apron, folded it once, set it on the counter beside the coffee pot. Then she picked up her small bag from underneath the register, walked around the counter, and moved toward the door. Marcus sat completely still. In 15 years of running one of the most feared criminal organizations on the eastern seaboard, no one had ever surprised him like this. He stood up slowly, dropped $300 on the table for a $40 meal, walked to the door. His head of security, Reno, stepped close and lowered his voice. Boss, who is she? Marcus watched Emily push through the diner door and walk calmly toward the SUVs like she'd been invited on a business trip. That, Marcus said quietly, is exactly what I'm going to find out. Nobody offered her the front seat. Emily didn't expect them to. She climbed into the middle row of the second SUV without being told, settled against the window, and clipped her seatbelt like she was catching a ride to the airport. The door closed. The engine rumbled. The Nevada desert swallowed the diner whole as the convoy pulled back onto the highway. Reno sat to her left. He hadn't introduced himself. Didn't need to. The way he held himself, spine straight, one hand resting near his jacket, said everything about what his job was and what he was willing to do it. He was watching her. She was watching the road, not casually, not the way passengers stare out windows to pass time. She was reading it, tracking the mile markers, noting each turn, calculating distance from the last visible landmark. When the lead SUV slowed slightly before a junction and then took the smaller road heading northwest instead of the interstate, she registered it without moving a muscle. Northwest. Away from Las Vegas, then cutting back in through the valley roads, avoiding cameras, avoiding toll booths, avoiding anything that logged a license plate at a specific time. Smart route, she thought, but one extra stop, and you add 40 minutes. Marcus sat in the first vehicle. She couldn't see him. Somehow, she could still feel the weight of his attention, even through steel and distance. For 20 minutes, no one spoke. Then, Reno's phone buzzed. He read something, glanced at her sideways, and put it away. He wants to talk to her, the driver said. A click on the radio. Then Marcus's voice came through a small speaker near the dashboard, low, unhurried, filling the cabin the way smoke fills a room. Tell me something true about yourself. Emily looked at the speaker the way most people look at a person. I make good coffee. A pause. That's not what I meant. I know. Another pause. Longer this time. She could feel Reno's surprise without looking at him. People didn't redirect Marcus Hale. They answered the question or they answered for not answering it. What's your name? Marcus asked. You already ran my plates, she said. You know my name. I know the name on your registration. That's not the same thing. She turned to look out the window again. The desert stretched flat and endless in every direction, the sky overhead so wide and dark, it felt like the world had forgotten to put a ceiling on itself. Emily, she said. Emily. He said it like he was weighing it. You do this often? Get into cars with strangers. You're not a stranger. That landed differently than she intended, or exactly as she intended. She let it sit. You know who I am, he said. It wasn't a question. Nevada has a gossip problem, she replied, especially along highway stops. Truckers talk, dispatchers talk. The man who called ahead to clear the next 2 exits so your convoy had clean passage. She paused just a half beat. He talked a little too loud near the counter. Silence on the radio. Then, Reno? Reno straightened beside her like his name was an alarm. Sir. Find out which dispatcher she means? Yes, sir. The radio clicked off. 2 miles passed in silence. Emily watched a distant ridge of rock catch a sliver of moonlight and disappear again as the road curved. She did the math on the route again in her head. They were making good time. The radio clicked back on. "Most people," Marcus said, "when they find out what I do, they get quiet or they get stupid. I'm neither." "No," he agreed. "What are you?" Emily considered it for a moment, not because she didn't have an answer. She always had an answer, but because the right answer, given at the right speed, was worth more than any quick reply. "Useful," she said finally. The radio stayed quiet for the rest of the drive. Las Vegas revealed itself slowly, first as a pale glow against the bottom of the sky, then as scattered lights along the valley floor, then suddenly, completely, as a city that never decided it was nighttime. They didn't go near the Strip. The convoy turned into a quieter neighborhood east of the main corridor. Low buildings, high walls, security cameras mounted at angles that covered every blind spot. The safe house was a property that looked, from the outside, like a mid-range event venue that had closed down. Plain exterior. No signage. A rolling steel gate that opened before the first SUV reached it, which meant someone inside was already watching the road 2 blocks out. Emily noted the camera placement as she stepped out of the vehicle. 4 visible. At least 2 hidden. She could tell by the way the lighting had been arranged to eliminate shadows in specific corners. The hidden ones were always pointed at the gaps the visible ones left. Someone smart had designed this layout. The inside was nothing like the outside. It was operational, clean, structured, every surface serving a purpose. A central room with monitors, a long table covered in documents and city maps, men moving with the kind of quiet efficiency that meant routine, not emergency. They looked at Emily the way she expected. Quick assessments, flat eyes, no welcome. She didn't need welcome. Marcus was already inside, jacket off, standing over the long table. He didn't acknowledge her entrance. He was in the middle of a conversation with 2 men she cataloged quickly. Older, both of them, careful with their words. The kind of trusted lieutenants who'd survived because instinct had kept them alive longer than loyalty alone. She stood near the edge of the room and waited. After 10 minutes, one of the men, stocky, salt and pepper beard, finally walked over. Looked her up and down with the particular contempt of someone who'd decided the conclusion before gathering any evidence. "You got a reason to be standing in this room?" he said. "Same reason you are," Emily replied. "He brought me here." The man's jaw tightened. He turned toward Marcus. "Boss, let her stand," Marcus said, without looking up from the map. The man walked away. Emily remained exactly where she was. She didn't move closer to the table, didn't try to insert herself. She just watched, the way the men organized information, the way decisions got made, who spoke first, and who waited to be asked. Everything told her something. At 3:17 a.m., Marcus finally looked at her across the room. The energy in that glance was different from the diner. Harder, more direct, like he'd spent the whole drive deciding what category to put her in, and arrived at the conclusion that no existing category worked. "Guest room's down the hall," he said. "Second door." Emily nodded. "Don't touch anything that isn't in that room." "I won't need to," she said simply. She walked down the hall, stepped into the small room, and closed the door behind her without making a sound. She sat on the edge of the bed, still and quiet in the dark. Tomorrow, she thought, it begins. She had planned for this exact moment for 8 months, and Marcus Hale had no idea. He thought he'd picked up a curiosity. He had no idea he'd picked up a chess player, one who'd been studying his game long before he ever sat down at the board. Emily was up before anyone else. Not because she couldn't sleep. She'd slept 4 clean hours, which was enough. She was up because early mornings in unfamiliar places were the most honest version of those places. No performance yet, no guard fully raised, just the raw shape of how things actually operated before people remembered to look composed. She moved quietly through the hallway, noted the one guard who'd fallen half asleep near the side entrance. Chin dipping, shoulders soft, the rifle across his lap slightly loose. She noted the coffee machine in the kitchen that nobody had set a timer on, which meant mornings here started slow and irritable. She noted the whiteboard in the side corridor, half covered with a sheet that hadn't been pinned properly at the bottom corner. She didn't lift the sheet. She didn't need to. The bottom 2 inches of what was visible told her enough. Delivery grid, time blocks, initials she'd match to faces later. She made coffee, not just for herself. She pulled enough mugs from the cabinet, checked how full the pot was, and calculated for 9 people based on the number of boots she'd counted near the entrance the previous night. When the first 2 men shuffled into the kitchen 20 minutes later, they found hot coffee waiting and said nothing, which was its own kind of acceptance. By 8 a.m., the safe house was operating. Marcus was already at the long table, working through the night's communications. His lieutenants filtered in. The energy in the room was focused but jagged at the edges, the kind of tension that came not from crisis, but from too many moving parts and not enough organization. Emily stood near the far wall, coffee in hand, and observed. She watched one of the men. She'd learned his name was Drift, a logistics coordinator who moved like he had 3 conversations happening in his head simultaneously. Stack 3 separate folders on top of each other, and then search for them 2 minutes later like they'd vanished. She watched another man, Torres, cross-reference 2 city maps that overlapped incorrectly, meaning every distance calculation he made was running about a mile short. She watched and she waited. At 9:15 a.m., Marcus looked up from the table and found her standing exactly where he'd last seen her. "You just going to stand there?" he asked. "Until there's something worth doing," she replied. A couple of the men glanced up. Reno, near the door, had the expression of someone watching a fuse burn and not knowing how long it was. Marcus studied her for a moment. Then, he pushed a stack of folders to the edge of the table. Drift's been trying to build a communications log from the last 72 hours. Every handoff, every checkpoint, every contact. He's missed 4. It wasn't an invitation. It was a test. Emily walked to the table, picked up the folders, and sat down. She worked without asking questions. That was the first thing that shifted the energy in the room. The men had expected her to ask for instructions, for clarification, for permission at every step. Instead, she sorted, cross-referenced, and began building a clean sequential log with nothing but the documents in front of her and whatever internal framework she'd already constructed from the previous night's observations. 40 minutes later, she set the completed log in front of Marcus. He read it without expression, but his stillness had a different quality than before. It was the stillness of someone recalibrating. He passed it to Drift without a word. Drift read it, jaw tightening slightly. Not because it was wrong, because it was right and thorough, and she'd done in 40 minutes what he hadn't managed in 6 hours. "She fixed Torres's map too," said one of the younger men near the back, almost amused. He pointed at the wall where Torres had been working. The 2 maps were now separated and correctly aligned, distances remarked in clean pen along the margin. Torres said nothing, but his eyes, when they landed on Emily, had moved from flat to sharp. The moment came just before noon. 3 of Marcus's senior men were huddled at the far end of the table, voices low, discussing a supply run scheduled for that afternoon. A route down through the industrial corridor southeast of the city. Emily was reorganizing the communications log into a binder nearby, close enough to hear without appearing to listen. She heard the route. She also heard why they'd chosen it. Familiar road, light traffic on Sundays, a contact at the 3rd checkpoint, All reasonable logic, all correct as of about 2 weeks ago. The problem was what had changed since then. Emily set the binder down and walked to the edge of their conversation. All three men looked up with expressions that clearly said she wasn't invited. She spoke anyway. "That corridor has a problem," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "The warehouse on DeSoto, the one 2 blocks east of your third checkpoint, changed ownership 11 days ago. New management brought in outside security that runs rotating street patrols between noon and 4 p.m. If your run hits that window, you'll have 3 extra sets of eyes on a block you think is clear." Silence. The 3 men looked at each other, then at her, then at Marcus, who had gone very still across the room. "How do you know that?" said the stocky one. She'd learned his name was Briggs. His voice had an edge that wasn't quite anger yet, but was close enough to borrow its posture. "I served a moving crew from that block last Tuesday," Emily said simply. "They mentioned the new management. People talk more when they're eating." Nobody responded immediately. "Run the South Access Road instead," she continued. "Longer by 9 minutes, but you skip the patrol window entirely." She went back to her binder. Marcus changed the route. He didn't announce it as her suggestion. Didn't frame it as anything other than a tactical adjustment. But he changed it, and 4 hours later, Reno received a call from the checkpoint contact. 2 unmarked vehicles had been sitting at the east end of the DeSoto block since 11 a.m., waiting. Someone had known about the original route, which meant there was either a leak or a setup, or both. Marcus handled that problem in his own way, in a room Emily wasn't in, and she was fine with that. What mattered was the stillness that fell over the safe house afterward. Men who had been watching her with mild contempt were now watching her with something else. Not respect. Not yet. That was earned differently in this world. But recognition. The specific, reluctant recognition of people who understood dangerous competence when it showed itself. Emily felt the shift in the room like a change in air pressure. She continued organizing the binder. It was Marcus who broke the silence. When the last of the debrief conversations had finished and most of the men had cleared the main room, he stood across the table, arms crossed, watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not amusement, not curiosity. Suspicion. Deep, focused, surgical suspicion. The kind that didn't ask questions loudly, but had already started digging in the dark. "Emily," he said quietly. She looked up. "Who are you?" She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to let him know the question didn't rattle her. Short enough to let him know she wasn't ready to answer it. "Someone who drinks bad coffee and notices things," she said. Then she closed the binder and walked back to her room. Behind her, Marcus didn't move. But she heard him pick up his phone. He'd invited a curiosity into his house. He was beginning to suspect he'd actually invited a mirror, one that reflected everything he hadn't wanted to look at directly. The report landed on Marcus's desk at 6 a.m., 12 pages. Every database his people had access to, and they had access to more than most governments would be comfortable knowing about. DMV records, tax filings, employment history, digital footprint, social media, banking activity, utility accounts, phone registrations. Marcus read it once, then again. Then he set it down and stared at the wall for a long moment. 12 pages of almost nothing. Emily Carter, age 34. Nevada driver's license, issued 4 years ago. A social security number that checked out but had almost no activity before 6 years back. No credit history older than 5 years. No employment records before the diner, which she'd worked at for 14 months. A lease agreement on a studio apartment in Henderson. Signed with first and last month's rent, paid in cash. No known family listed. No college records. No digital footprint worth the name. No social media. No emails tied to her name on any platform. One online purchase from a hardware store 18 months ago. She existed, but only just. Like someone had taken a real person and carefully removed every layer that made them traceable, then constructed just enough surface detail to pass a casual check. Enough to rent an apartment, enough to get a job. Enough to be, technically, a person. Not enough to have actually lived. Marcus had seen records this clean before. Twice. Once on a government operative who'd been embedded in his organization for 3 months before Reno caught a single inconsistency in a story about a childhood home. Once on a rival who'd turned out to be running 3 different identities across 2 countries. Neither situation had ended gently. He called Reno in at 6:30. "She's a ghost," Reno said, standing across the desk, reading the same conclusion Marcus had already reached. 6 years of history, nothing before. The SSN is real, but it's got a gap that doesn't match her age. "She's 34, Marcus said. "That means roughly 10 years of her life simply don't exist on paper. Could be witness protection. Could be," Marcus said. "Could be a lot of things." Reno set the report down. "You want me to bring her in?" Marcus considered it. "No, I'll talk to her myself." Reno's expression shifted slightly, just a fraction, but Marcus caught it. Reno had been with him for 11 years, long enough that his face occasionally said what his mouth had learned not to. "She's still just a woman who walked out of a diner," Marcus said, reading the expression. "She predicted an ambush on her second day," Reno replied evenly. "She's not just anything." Marcus didn't answer that. He picked up the report again, turned to the last page, and looked at the single photograph his team had pulled, a grainy image from a Henderson convenience store camera. Emily walking through the parking lot, bag on her shoulder, head slightly down, but eyes clearly scanning the street ahead. Even in a blurry still frame, the body language was unmistakable, not casual, calibrated. He had her brought to the private office at 9 a.m. It was a deliberate choice. Not the main room where the men would hear every word, not a neutral space that gave her comfort. His office, his desk, his walls lined with the evidence of what he'd built and what he was capable of. It was the room where people understood, very clearly, what kind of conversation they were having. Emily walked in, looked around once with those measuring eyes, and sat down in the chair across from his desk without being asked. He hadn't offered her the chair yet. She sat anyway. Marcus let that go and took his own seat. He slid the report across the desk toward her. She looked at it. Didn't pick it up. 12 pages, he said. "You want to know what they say?" "Not particularly," she replied. "I know what they say." 6 years, Emily. That's all we found. Before that, he spread his hands slightly. Nothing. No school, no family, no address, no history. She said nothing. "I've seen records this clean twice in my career," he continued. Both times it didn't end well for the person the records belonged to. Still nothing. He leaned forward. "I'm not a patient man, and I'm not someone who asks the same question more than twice. So I'll ask once. Who are you, and who sent you?" Emily looked at him for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was even. Not defiant, not frightened. Measured. "Nobody sent me," she said. "I put myself in your path." The room got very quiet. "Deliberately?" Marcus said. "Yes." He studied her face for the tells that should have been there, the micro-expressions, the eye movement, the slight tension around the jaw that everybody showed when they were managing a lie under pressure. He found none of them, not because she was hiding them expertly, but because she wasn't lying. That almost made it worse. "Why?" he said. "I'll answer that," she said. "But not the part you're asking. Not yet." Marcus's jaw tightened. "You're sitting in my office, in my building, in the middle of my operation. You don't get to decide what you answer, and when." "I do," she said simply. Because if I wanted to disappear, I'd already be gone, and you know that. I'm still here because I chose to be. That should tell you something." He stared at her. She stared back. The audacity of it should have made him angry. It was the kind of calm defiance that in his world usually preceded something very unpleasant happening to the person displaying it. And yet, the logic underneath it was sound. She was right. She'd had opportunities to leave. Last night, during the 2-hour window when the side entrance guard had been half asleep and the cameras cycled. She hadn't taken any of them. He'd checked. "The past I left behind," she said, filling the silence carefully, "has nothing to do with law enforcement, rival organizations, or any threat to you. I'm not a plant. I'm not carrying anything. Check my bag again if you want. I'm not recording this conversation." She paused. "What I am is someone who spent a long time studying how power actually moves. Not the way it looks from the outside, the way it actually works. The decisions behind the decisions, the vulnerabilities underneath the strength." She held his gaze. "I came here because you're the most structurally interesting operation I've encountered, and because you have a problem with your inner circle that you haven't identified yet." That last line sat in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Marcus felt something move behind his expression that he kept very carefully off his face, because she'd just named, with complete casualness, the exact thing that had been keeping him up at night for 3 months. "You don't know anything about my inner circle," he said. "Briggs has been skimming from the Chicago account," Emily said. "Not enough to be obvious. Enough to matter when you add it up over 18 months. The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus said nothing for a very long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. Quieter was always more dangerous. "If you're wrong," he said, "this conversation ends badly." Emily nodded slowly. "I know." "And if you're right?" She met his eyes without hesitation. "Then you stop looking at me like a problem," she said, "and start looking at me like an asset." Marcus leaned back in his chair. He looked at her for a long moment. This woman with no past and too much perception, sitting in his chair in his office like she'd been here before in some version of this conversation and already knew how it ended. Dangerous, he thought. Absolutely, completely dangerous, but valuable. The two things weren't mutually exclusive. In his world, they rarely were. "Get out of my office," he said finally. Emily stood, smoothed her jacket, and walked to the door. "Emily." She stopped, didn't turn around. "The background check on Briggs starts today," he said quietly. A pause. "I know," she said. She left without looking back. He had wanted answers. What he got instead was a deeper question, one he wasn't sure he was ready to follow all the way to the end. But he was already following it. The drive to Los Angeles left before sunrise. No explanation was given to Emily. No briefing, no preparation, no outline of what the day involved. Marcus had simply appeared in the hallway at 4 a.m., looked at her, and said, "You're coming." Then he walked to the vehicles. She was ready in 4 minutes. That detail, 4 minutes, bag packed, no questions asked, did not go unnoticed by Reno, who had been standing in the hallway, timing it without appearing to. The convoy moved through the pre-dawn darkness in silence, headlights cutting through the flat desert stretch between Las Vegas and the California border. Emily sat in the second vehicle again, watching the sky shift from black to the kind of deep, bruised purple that comes just before the world remembers it's supposed to have color. She had spent the previous night running probabilities. If Marcus was bringing her to a meeting, there were 2 reasons. Either he wanted to see how she performed under real pressure, strip away the controlled environment of the safe house, and put her in a room where the stakes were actual and immediate. Or he wanted to use her as a variable. Something unexpected he could introduce into a situation to read how others reacted. Both reasons were fine with her. She was ready for both. The warehouse sat in a commercial district in East Los Angeles, the kind of area where industrial buildings sat shoulder to shoulder, and nobody asked what the building next door actually manufactured. High ceiling, concrete floor, the smell of metal and old motor oil baked into every surface. Skylights let in gray morning light that fell in flat rectangles across the floor. 3 groups were already inside when Marcus entered. Emily walked in behind him, slightly to his left, close enough to be noticed, far enough back to be read as support rather than equal. She cataloged the room in the first 8 seconds. 12 men total, divided by the way they'd arranged themselves in the space. Marcus's crew took the left side. Reno, Briggs, Torres, 4 others. The opposing group, centered around a sharp-suited man in his 50s named Valdez, occupied the right. Between them, almost deliberately neutral in his positioning, stood a man Emily hadn't seen before. Mid-40s, lean, expensive watch on the wrong wrist. Left-handed man wearing a right-handed watch, which meant the watch wasn't really his. Wire-rimmed glasses he touched twice in the first minute, which meant he wasn't used to wearing them. Standing close enough to Valdez's group to seem affiliated, but angled slightly away. She clocked him and filed it. Then she found her position along the back wall and went still. The meeting was a negotiation over territory, a distribution corridor running through the San Fernando Valley that both Marcus and Valdez had partial claim to. The kind of meeting that looked like business, but had the specific atmospheric pressure of something that could stop being business very quickly. Marcus took the lead position. Valdez sat across from him. The tone was controlled, professional, the language coded in the comfortable ambiguity of men who never said directly what they meant. Emily watched the neutral man. He was watching Marcus, not the way everyone else in the room was watching Marcus, with the focused attention of negotiation or the calculated readiness of security. He was watching Marcus the way someone watches a door they intend to go through. Studying timing, measuring distance. She also noticed what he was doing with his right hand. Small movements kept low near his thigh. Not a weapon, not yet. A phone. He was typing without looking at it. Short bursts, sending signals. She understood then. He wasn't neutral. He was the middle point of a triangle, and the third point of that triangle was somewhere outside this building, waiting for a signal. This was not a negotiation. This was a staged event designed to end with Marcus contained, or worse. Emily looked at Reno across the room. He was watching the proceedings, not the room. He hadn't clocked it. She needed to move carefully. Any sudden signal in a room this tense would trigger exactly what she was trying to prevent. She couldn't cross to Marcus. That distance was too visible. She couldn't speak aloud. She had 30 seconds, maybe less. She picked up a folded city map from the table along the back wall. There were several spread out for reference, and walked the length of the room at a completely unhurried pace, as though she was simply delivering something she'd been asked to retrieve. Calm, purposeful, boring. She set the map on the table in front of Marcus, and as she straightened, she spoke 3 words near his ear, barely above a whisper. Third man. Phone. Then she stepped back and returned to the wall. Marcus didn't react. Not outwardly. He continued the sentence he was midway through, nodded at something Valdez said, and shifted his posture slightly, leaning back, opening his body language in a way that read as relaxed, but repositioned his sightline to include the neutral man without appearing to look directly at him. 15 seconds passed. Then Marcus smiled. The rare, unhurried smile of a man who has just decided the game is already over. Valdez, he said, before we continue, I want to introduce someone. He gestured toward Emily without looking at her. Every head in the room turned. My new strategic consultant, Marcus said. She's been reviewing the Valley Corridor proposal, and she has some interesting observations about the exit structure of this building. Silence. The neutral man stopped typing. Particularly, Marcus continued, his tone the same pleasant, conversational register throughout, the eastern loading bay, the one that's been on a manual lock override for the last 20 minutes. He tilted his head slightly, which is interesting because nobody from my team touched that lock. The temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees. Valdez's expression moved, just briefly, just enough, through something that wasn't quite surprise. It was the expression of someone watching a plan dissolve before deployment. What followed happened quickly and without violence, which was the most controlled possible outcome. Valdez's men recalculated odds in real time and found them insufficient. The neutral man was relieved of his phone. The eastern loading bay was checked. 2 armed men outside it, waiting for a signal that wasn't coming. Marcus walked out of that warehouse 20 minutes later, having negotiated a full corridor concession from Valdez, who had run out of leverage the moment his setup was exposed. In the vehicle afterward, nobody spoke for a long time. Then Briggs, sitting in the front of Marcus's SUV, said, loudly enough to carry, "She's going to be a problem." He wasn't wrong, just not in the way he meant. Back at the safe house that evening, the air had changed. The men who'd been cautiously neutral toward Emily that morning were now something harder. A specific resentment that came from watching someone walk into your world and immediately perform better in it than you had been. It wasn't loud. It was the kind of quiet that watched and waited. Emily felt it and said nothing. She sat at the long table, calmly writing up a debrief of the warehouse meeting that nobody had asked for, noting structural vulnerabilities Marcus could use in future negotiations. Across the room, Marcus watched her write. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes had the quality of someone recalculating a situation they thought they'd already calculated fully. She had just saved his life. She hadn't even looked particularly busy doing it. The crew wanted her gone. Marcus was beginning to think he'd never needed anyone more. Both things were problems, but only one of them kept him up that night. The call came at 2 a.m. Marcus took it in the hallway outside the main room, voice low, back turned. Emily heard 3 words through the door before it clicked shut. "Chicago, tomorrow. Confirmed." That was enough. She went back to bed and reset her internal clock for 4 a.m. She was right. By 4:15, the safe house was moving. The flight was private, a small charter out of a Henderson airstrip that didn't log passenger names with the kind of enthusiasm commercial airports did. Emily boarded without being asked to sign anything. She sat 2 rows behind Marcus, and for 2 hours she watched the back of his head and thought about Chicago. She knew Chicago well, not from any record that would show up in a background check. But she knew the way its neighborhoods shifted at the seams, where money met desperation, where old alliances had fossilized into new vulnerabilities. She knew which corridors the powerful used and which ones they didn't know existed. She'd spent 4 months in that city once, learning exactly those things, for exactly this kind of moment. She said nothing about any of that. She looked out the window and watched the country pass beneath them like a map that hadn't finished being drawn. They landed outside the city and drove in through the south side, taking surface roads that bypassed the main expressways. Marcus sat in the front this time, Reno beside him. Emily was placed in the second vehicle again. A pattern she'd noticed was deliberate. Close enough to include, far enough to contain. The briefing happened in the car. Reno turned halfway in his seat, a tablet in his hand, and delivered the situation with the crisp economy of someone who'd done this many times. A Chicago outfit, the Merrick organization, had made contact through a third party. Ostensibly a business conversation, a territorial understanding, the kind of meeting that happened periodically in their world, 2 powers acknowledging each other's edges without crossing them. Merrick's been quiet for 2 years. Reno said. No moves, no noise. Now suddenly he wants a sit-down. 2 years of quiet followed by a sudden meeting request? Emily said. Reno looked at her. Yes. That's not a peace gesture, she said. That's a conclusion. Reno said nothing, but she saw his jaw move slightly. The motion of a man filing something away, without admitting he was filing it. In the front seat, Marcus didn't turn around, but his posture shifted in a way Emily had learned to read. A slight squaring of the shoulders that meant he was listening more carefully than he appeared to be. Downtown Chicago in November had a particular quality. The wind off the lake moved through the streets with a cold, flat authority, and the city met it without complaint, as if it had long ago decided that hardship was just weather by another name. The meeting location was a private dining room above a restaurant in the West Loop. Neutral territory, supposedly. Emily walked the exterior twice before entering, under the pretense of taking a call. She noted the vehicle arrangement across the street. 3 cars. One of them had been idling for 40 minutes based on the condensation pattern on the exhaust pipe. Waiting, not parked. She also noticed the man standing near the corner newspaper box who hadn't looked at the newspapers once. She went inside and found Marcus at the table. The Merrick representatives arrived 7 minutes late, a calculated discourtesy designed to establish a psychological edge before a single word was spoken. 2 men, both heavy, both wearing the particular expression of people who had decided the outcome in advance and were simply waiting for the event to catch up. Emily sat against the wall, not at the table. She'd positioned herself before Marcus arrived, which meant when the Merrick men entered, they registered her as furniture, ambient, irrelevant, wallpaper with a heartbeat. People consistently underestimated what a woman sitting quietly against a wall could hear. The conversation was civil for exactly 11 minutes. The Merrick representative, a thick-necked man named Dobrescu, who had the accent of someone who'd grown up in one country and learned cruelty in another, laid out a proposal that was structured as a business arrangement but functioned as an ultimatum. Marcus's operation would cede the Northern Transit Corridor. In exchange, the Merrick organization would extend what Dobrescu called operational courtesy, which Emily translated instantly as, "We won't move against you if you give us what we want." Marcus listened without expression. His hands were flat on the table. His breathing was even. Emily was watching the second Merrick man. He hadn't spoken once, hadn't touched his food. His eyes moved between Marcus and the door in a rhythm that was too regular to be casual. Every 90 seconds, precisely, like a man counting down rather than waiting. She looked at the wineglass in front of him, full, untouched since it was poured. A man who doesn't eat, doesn't drink, and checks the door every 90 seconds is not attending a meeting. He's timing one. She shifted her weight forward and caught Marcus's eyeline with the smallest, most deliberate movement. A micro-adjustment of her chin toward the second man, then toward the door. 2 gestures, less than a second. Marcus blinked once. Received. "I'll need to use the facilities," Marcus said, standing unhurried, his tone carrying the complete disinterest of a man who had all the time in the world. He looked at Reno. "Join me." Dobrescu's expression flickered, just a fraction, the flicker of a plan losing a crucial element. "The conversation isn't finished," he said. "It'll keep," Marcus replied pleasantly. In the 30 seconds Marcus and Reno were out of the room, Emily stayed exactly where she was. Dobrescu looked at her once, the dismissive glance of a man checking whether furniture had moved. Then away. She counted. At the 60-second mark, the sound reached them from outside. Not an explosion, not gunfire. The sharp, compressed sound of a vehicle being blocked. Tires, voices, metal. The man who'd been watching the door went very still. Marcus walked back into the room 30 seconds later, jacket perfectly in place, expression unchanged. He sat down, picked up his drink, and looked at Dobrescu with the particular calm of a man who has just removed every card from your hand while you were watching the door. "You had 3 vehicles outside," Marcus said. "Present tense problem. You now have none." What followed was not pleasant, and Emily did not witness all of it. She was moved to a secure vehicle 2 blocks away while Marcus finished the conversation, in the way these conversations sometimes had to finish. She sat in the back seat and listened to the city outside, the wind, the traffic, the ordinary noise of a place that had no idea what was happening 3 floors above, a restaurant on a Tuesday morning. Reno appeared at the vehicle window 20 minutes later. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to it. The reluctant recognition of a man who protected people for a living and had just watched someone protect his principal better than he had. "How did you know?" he asked. "He didn't drink," Emily said. Reno was quiet for a moment. "The vehicles." "Condensation on the exhaust," she said. 40-minute idle. Nobody waits 40 minutes for a restaurant reservation." Reno said nothing else. He straightened, looked up the street, and then said, quietly, not looking at her, "Good eye." It was the closest thing to a compliment she'd received in 4 days. She watched him walk back toward the building. Then she looked down at her hands in her lap, steady, still, completely calm. And she thought about what came next, because Chicago wasn't the test she'd been preparing for. It was just the door. What was behind it? The truth Marcus would eventually demand, the thing she'd been carrying for 3 years. That was the test. And it was coming tomorrow. She had read their moves before they made them, but the move she hadn't fully prepared for was the one Marcus was about to make. The one that didn't come from strategy. The one that came from trust. The Chicago safe house was different from Las Vegas. Smaller, older, a converted brownstone in a quiet residential block that looked from the outside like every other building on the street, maintained but unremarkable, the kind of property that existed in a neighborhood without contributing to it. Inside, it had the feeling of a place that had held serious conversations for a long time. The walls had absorbed them. The silence had weight. Emily had been given a room on the 2nd floor. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the house settle around her. The murmur of voices downstairs, the distant sound of the city outside, the particular stillness of a building where people were either asleep or pretending to be. She had been waiting for this night for 3 years. Not this specific room, not this specific city, but this moment. The moment when the distance between what Marcus knew and what was true finally became too small to navigate around. She had always known it would come. She had prepared for it the way you prepare for surgery. Not by hoping it wouldn't happen, but by making sure you were strong enough to survive it. The knock came at 11 p.m. Not Reno, not Briggs. The knock had a different quality, unhurried, certain, the knock of someone who wasn't asking permission to enter, but was extending the courtesy of announcing himself first. "Marcus." "Come in," she said. He entered alone. No Reno outside the door, no security posture. Just him, in a dark shirt, the jacket gone for the first time she could remember. He looked, not tired exactly, stripped down, like a man who had decided to have a conversation that didn't have room for the performance of authority. He closed the door, pulled the single chair from the corner, and sat facing her, elbows on his knees, hands loosely clasped. The space between them was small enough that there was nowhere for deflection to go. "No more tests," he said quietly. "No more waiting to see what you do next. I need the truth. All of it." Emily looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "My name is actually Emily," she said. "That part's real. Emily Carter is not." Marcus said nothing. His expression didn't change. He was in listening mode. The deep, absolute listening of a man who had built an empire partly on the ability to hear what people said and what they didn't simultaneously. "My real name is Emily Reeves," she said. "My father was Daniel Reeves. He ran a mid-sized manufacturing company in Ohio. Industrial parts, nothing glamorous, but it employed 400 people and it was his entire life." She paused. Not for effect, because the next part still cost something to say even now. 8 years ago, the company was leveraged into a financing arrangement through a series of private investment vehicles. Shell companies. It looked like a growth opportunity. It was a controlled collapse. She held his gaze. The money didn't go to investment. It was siphoned through 3 intermediary accounts into a fund that was already being used to clean revenue from organized crime operations. When the structure collapsed, my father's company was holding debt it hadn't knowingly assumed. 400 people lost their jobs. My father lost everything: the business, the house, eventually his health. She stopped. He died 2 years later. The official cause was a heart attack. The actual cause was a man who spent the last 18 months of his life trying to understand how it happened and never getting an answer. The room was very quiet. "I was 26 when it started," she continued. "I had just finished a postgraduate research fellowship. Financial systems, organizational structures, specifically how capital moves through informal networks. Academic work, theoretical." Her voice remained level. "After my father died, it stopped being theoretical." Marcus unclasped his hands. Slowly. "I spent the next 3 years learning everything I could about how organized financial crime actually operates. Not from the outside, from the inside. I embedded in 3 different environments before yours. A logistics company in Miami that was running currency through freight invoices. A private equity group in Dallas with 2 shell layers between them and the source. I never stayed long, never long enough to be found. I observed, I documented, and I left." "Documented for who?" Marcus said. His voice was carefully neutral. "For myself," Emily said. "Not law enforcement, not a rival, no one commissioned this. I'm not working for anyone, Marcus. I came here alone, and I leave alone." His eyes moved across her face, searching, calibrating. "Then why?" he said. "Why me specifically? Why this organization?" Emily took a breath. "Because yours is the only one I've studied that isn't structurally rotten at the core," she said. That landed differently than anything else she'd said. She watched it move through him, the surprise he almost concealed, the slight recalibration of his posture. "The Miami operation collapsed 8 months after I left," she continued. "The Dallas group is going to implode within the year. The 3rd shell layer has a government audit coming that they don't know about yet. Both of them were fundamentally corrupt from the foundation. Every decision made from ego, short-term gain, no actual intelligence at the operational level." She paused. "Your organization runs differently. It's disciplined. The hierarchy actually functions. The problems you have, the internal trust issues, the Briggs situation, those are fixable. The others weren't fixable. They were terminal." Marcus was very still. "You're not here for revenge," he said slowly. "No." "You're not here to destroy anything." "No." "Then what?" he said. "What exactly did you come here to do?" Emily looked at him directly. "The financial structure that destroyed my father's company, the men at the top of it, the ones who designed the mechanism, they're protected," she said. "Not by law enforcement, by the same networks that your world and their world share at the edges. Corrupt accountants, complicit banks, intermediaries who speak both languages." Her voice remained steady, but there was something underneath it now. Not anger, something older and colder than anger. Clarity. "I can't touch them from the outside. I tried for 2 years. Every official channel leads to a wall. Every investigative route ends at a door that's already been closed." She leaned forward slightly. "But from the inside?" From a position within an operation with the reach and the intelligence network that yours has, I can find the specific threads that connect your world to theirs. I can pull those threads in a way that exposes them without destroying what you've built. She held his gaze. I didn't come to burn your house down, Marcus. I came to use it to burn theirs. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. Marcus stood up, walked to the window, stood with his back to her, looking out at the dark Chicago street below, the amber glow of the streetlights on wet pavement. His hands were at his sides. She could see the tension in them from across the room. Not anger, she had learned to read the difference, but the particular tension of a man reprocessing everything he thought he understood about a situation. When he turned around, his expression had changed. The suspicion was still there. It would probably always be there. It was too deeply built into who he was to simply dissolve. But something else had joined it. Something that looked, in the low light of the Chicago safe house, uncomfortably close to recognition. "The people who took your father's company," he said quietly. "You have names?" "3 confirmed," Emily said. 2 probable. Marcus looked at her for a long time. "And you think you can connect them to my network's edge contacts?" "I already have one connection," she said. "I found it in the delivery grid on your whiteboard in Las Vegas, the bottom 2 inches that weren't covered properly." Marcus closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, something had shifted, something fundamental and irreversible, like a door that only opened one direction. "You've been building this case," he said. "Since before the diner." 8 months before the diner, she said. He stared at her. "You walked into my life," he said slowly, "carrying 3 years of grief, 2 years of research, 8 months of planning." He stopped. "And you said okay to a joke." Emily almost smiled. Almost. "It wasn't a joke to me," she said quietly. Marcus sat back down in the chair. He looked at the floor for a long moment. Then he looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw something she hadn't expected to see from a man like him. Not just calculation, understanding. "The people who destroyed your family," he said quietly. "If we find them, what do you want done?" Emily's answer came without hesitation. "Exposure," she said. "Everything public, everything provable. No quiet disappearances. That protects the system. I want the system broken." Marcus held her gaze for a long time. Then he said one word. "Okay." She had carried the weight of it alone for 3 years. And in a safe house in Chicago, of all places, in front of a man most of the world feared, she finally put it down. New York arrived the way it always did, without asking. The skyline came up through the car window like an argument nobody had started, but everybody was already having, all steel and glass and absolute certainty about its own importance. Emily watched it from the back seat and felt for the first time in 8 months that the trajectory of everything she'd set in motion was no longer theoretical. It was here. It was now. It was the city where everything would either consolidate or collapse. Marcus's main operation was based in a penthouse on the Upper East Side. Not a safe house, not a temporary base. His actual headquarters. The difference was immediate and significant. Where the Las Vegas and Chicago locations had the functional, stripped-down quality of operational outposts, this space had permanence. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. A central room that functioned as both command center and boardroom. Art on the walls that had been chosen by someone with taste rather than someone filling space. And people. More people. A full inner circle. Emily walked in behind Marcus and felt the shift in atmosphere instantly. Not the wariness of men encountering an unknown quantity, but something more organized than that. These people had been briefed. They had opinions already formed, positions already taken, and the energy in the room had the particular quality of a verdict that hadn't been announced yet, but had already been decided. 7 men stood around the central table. Senior lieutenants, the ones who had built this operation alongside Marcus, who had history with him measured in years and scars rather than weeks. Men who had earned their positions through loyalty and survival, and were not, under any circumstances, interested in watching a woman they'd never met walk in from nowhere and stand at the front of their world. Marcus introduced her without ceremony. Emily, she's part of the inner circle effective today. The silence that followed had texture. Briggs, who had flown up separately and arrived first, which Emily noted as deliberate positioning, spoke before anyone else could. "With respect," he said, and the phrase carried absolutely none. "We don't know this woman. She's been here 6 days. The crew in LA and Chicago can attest she's perceptive, fine, but inner circle means access to everything. Routes, contacts, financials, strategy." He looked at Marcus directly. That's not a decision that should be made in 6 days. Several of the men shifted in the specific way of people who agreed, but were waiting to see how the wind moved before committing to the direction. Marcus looked at Briggs. "Noted," he said simply, and moved on. It wasn't a resolution. It was a deferral, and everyone in the room understood the difference. Briggs understood it most of all. His jaw set in a way that said this conversation wasn't finished. It was simply being relocated to somewhere Marcus wasn't. Emily took her position at the far end of the table and said nothing. She didn't need to win the room today. She needed to be present when the room revealed itself. The first 2 hours were operational. Route reviews, contact updates, financial summaries presented by a quiet, precise man named Calloway, who handled the organization's money with the focused detachment of someone who had long ago separated the numbers from what they represented. Emily listened, cataloged, cross-referenced internally against everything she'd absorbed in the previous 6 days. She caught 4 inconsistencies in Calloway's presentation. Small ones, the kind that individually meant nothing but collectively described a pattern. She wrote none of them down. She kept them in her head where they were safer. At the 2-hour mark, Marcus called a short break. Emily remained at the table while the others dispersed toward coffee and private conversations. She was aware of the geometry of the room, who gathered with whom, who stood near the windows and who stood near the door, who spoke first and who waited to be approached. Briggs stood with 3 men in the far corner. Low voices, eyes that moved to her twice in 4 minutes. She looked away before they could register she'd noticed. The crisis announced itself at 3 p.m. Calloway came back into the room with a different energy, controlled, but altered in the specific way of someone who has just received information that changes the shape of everything. He went directly to Marcus and spoke quietly. Marcus's expression didn't change, but his eyes did. They sharpened in a way she'd seen before, in Chicago, when the situation had shifted without warning. He looked at Emily across the room. She was already looking at him. "Calloway," Marcus said, raising his voice to bring the room back. "Tell them what you told me." Calloway straightened. "The Jersey Transit account has been accessed from an external terminal in the last 40 minutes. 43,000 moved in 3 transfers, each just under the threshold that triggers automatic flagging. The access credentials were valid. Senior level." The room went very still. "Someone from inside this organization," Marcus said, "is moving money. Right now." Every person in the room did the thing people do when they're guilty of something. They evaluated everyone else before evaluating themselves, and in that half-second of universal deflection, Emily watched all 7 faces. 6 of them showed versions of genuine shock. One of them, barely just at the edges, just for the fraction of a second before discipline caught up with instinct, showed relief. Not that the theft had been discovered, that it had been discovered now, before something else happened. Emily understood immediately. The money wasn't the operation. The money was the distraction. She stood up. "Lock the elevator," she said. Every head turned. "Right now," she said, looking at Marcus. "Lock the elevator and the stairwell access on this floor. Nobody leaves this room." Marcus held her gaze for 1 second. Then, Reno. Reno was already moving. "The account transfer is a diversion," Emily said, her voice even, filling the room cleanly. "It's designed to pull your attention downward, to the money, to the external terminal, to whoever executed the transfer. While you're looking at that," she paused, "someone in this room signals the real move." "What real move?" Briggs said. His voice had an edge that was trying very hard to sound like skepticism and was working less well than usual. Emily looked at him. "The Merrick organization didn't stop at Chicago," she said. "They made a second approach. Not external this time, internal. Someone in this room has been feeding them operational details for at least 3 weeks. The transit account wasn't robbed. It was activated as a signal. A confirmation that the inner circle was assembled and distracted." She kept her eyes on Briggs. "Meaning they're already moving on the secondary target." The room held its breath. Marcus said quietly, "What's the secondary target?" "Calloway's financial records," Emily said. "The real ones, not the operational summaries, the foundational ledgers, the ones that connect this organization to every contact, every account, every arrangement it's built over 15 years. She paused. "Whoever gets those records gets the keys to everything you've built, and the ability to dismantle it or weaponize it from the outside." Silence. Then Marcus turned to look at Briggs, and Briggs, for the first time in the 6 days Emily had known him, had nothing composed to put on his face. What followed was not something Emily participated in directly. It was handled with the swift, cold efficiency of an organization that had survived this long precisely because it knew how to close a wound before it became fatal. Briggs was removed from the room. Calloway's records were secured and relocated within the hour. The Merrick approach, confirmed through Briggs's phone once Reno had it, was intercepted at the building's secondary access point. 2 men, both handled. By 6 p.m., it was over. The room that had watched Emily with resentment and suspicion 6 hours earlier was now quiet in a completely different way. The quiet of people who had just watched the building catch fire and been saved by the one person they'd voted to throw out. Marcus stood at the window as the city shifted into its evening light, the skyline doing its indifferent, magnificent thing outside. Emily stood beside him. "Briggs," he said quietly. "How long have you known?" "Since Las Vegas," she said. "The skimming confirmed the motive. Chicago confirmed the method. Tonight confirmed the timing." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "You let it play out," he said. "It wasn't an accusation." "I needed you to see it yourself," she said. "Not because I told you, because you'd have spent the rest of your life wondering if I'd manufactured it." He turned to look at her then. Really look at her, the way he hadn't fully allowed himself to before. And in his expression was something that had taken 6 days of surviving, calculating and saving his organization to earn. Not gratitude, something more durable than gratitude. Respect. "What now?" he said. Emily looked out at the city. "Now," she said, "we build something better." He had spent 15 years being the most dangerous person in every room he entered. For the first time, he wasn't entirely sure that was still true. And somehow, for the first time in a very long time, that felt less like a threat and more like a relief. The rooftop was Marcus's. Not officially. Nothing in his world was official in the way most people understood the word, but the building was his, and the rooftop was where he went when the weight of everything below it became something he needed distance from. A simple space, no furniture beyond 2 weathered chairs and a low metal table, a railing along the edge that had seen better decades. The kind of place that existed not for aesthetics, but for altitude. He came up here to think. He had never brought anyone else. He brought Emily. She didn't comment on it. Just stepped out through the rooftop door, felt the November wind come off the Hudson with its particular cold authority, and stood at the railing, looking out at the city the way someone looks at a thing they've been thinking about for a long time and are finally seeing clearly. New York at dusk was its own argument. The light came off the buildings at an angle that made everything look simultaneously permanent and precarious. All that steel and certainty, and underneath it, the constant, invisible negotiation of 10 million lives pressing against each other without collapsing. Marcus stood beside her and said nothing for a while. That was new. The silence between them had changed. It had started 6 days ago in a Nevada diner as the silence of 2 strangers, one cautious, one concealing. Then it had become the silence of suspicion, then of testing, then of gradual, reluctant recalibration. Now it was simply the silence of 2 people who had run out of reasons to pretend they didn't understand each other. Briggs gave up 2 names before the end, Marcus said finally. The men in the Merrick organization who coordinated the approach. Emily nodded. One of them, Marcus said, has a banking relationship with a private investment vehicle registered in the Cayman Islands. He paused. The vehicle was incorporated 8 years ago. The registered agent is a firm called Harlow Partners. Emily's hands tightened on the railing. Barely, almost nothing. Marcus noticed. Harlow Partners, she said. Her voice was even. The effort that took was invisible to anyone who hadn't learned to read her. That's one of the 3 shell layers above the fund that processed my father's debt. Yes, Marcus said. I know. She turned to look at him. I started pulling the thread the morning after Chicago, he said. While you were sleeping. He met her gaze directly. You came here carrying a 3-year case. I had it confirmed and triangulated in 14 hours. Emily looked at him for a long moment. You have reach I don't, she said quietly. Yes, he said. I do. The city hummed below them. Somewhere far down, a siren moved through the streets and faded. The wind came again, steadier now, carrying the cold smell of the river. I have 3 names, Emily said. The men at the top of the structure, the ones who designed the mechanism, signed off on the targets, and walked away clean while 400 families absorbed the damage. I have 2 more, Marcus said, which means between us, we have all 5. Emily closed her eyes for just a moment. 3 years, 8 months of placement, 6 days of survival in a world that had every reason to destroy her. And now, 5 names. Complete. Confirmed. Traceable. She opened her eyes. Then it's time to talk about what comes next, she said. Marcus turned from the railing and sat in one of the weathered chairs, leaning back, looking up at the sky rather than the city. The last of the daylight was leaving. The stars weren't visible yet. Too much ambient light, too much city, but the sky had that deep, transitional blue that existed for about 20 minutes each evening before darkness finished the job. I want to offer you a position, he said. Formal, compensated, full protection under my organization's coverage. You'd have more security than you've had in 3 years, more resources than you've operated with, and direct access to the intelligence network you've been trying to reach from the outside. He looked at her. You'd work under me, my structure, my decisions at the top. But your autonomy within that structure would be significant. Emily looked at him. She had known this offer was coming, had modeled it, prepared for it, knew every reason it made tactical sense and every reason it was wrong. No, she said. Marcus's expression didn't change. He'd expected it. Maybe not the speed of it, but the answer. "You're going to tell me why," he said. "Because under means beneath," she said, not unkindly. "And beneath means your decisions override mine when they conflict. At some point, they'll conflict, Marcus. Not because we're opposed. We're not. But because we see different things. I see the structural vulnerabilities your people miss because they're too close to the operation. You see the full operational picture I can't access alone." She turned to face him fully. Neither of those perspectives should sit beneath the other. Both of them should sit at the same table. Marcus was quiet. "Partnership," he said. "Equal standing," she said. "Separate domains with mutual veto on anything that crosses both. You run the operational structure. I don't want that, and I wouldn't do it as well as you do. I run the intelligence and strategic layer. Financial forensics, threat anticipation, the analytical work your organization has been doing on instinct and experience and doing well, but could do significantly better with actual systematic methodology." She paused. "And we use the combined resources to expose the 5 names. Everything documented, everything traceable, everything handed to the right journalist, the right regulator, the right federal prosecutor who hasn't already been reached. Not a quiet disappearance. A public dismantling. The kind that changes the system instead of just removing people from it." Marcus looked at her for a long time. The calculation was visible. Not because he was transparent. He was almost never transparent. But because this particular calculation was large enough that even he couldn't perform it invisibly. 15 years of solo command. An organization built on the understanding that there was one person at the top and every structure below that person existed to support that singularity. Opening that to another presence, equal, autonomous, permanent, was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the thing he had never done. For anyone. "You understand what you're asking me to give up," he said. "I understand exactly what I'm asking," she said. "The same thing you'd be asking me. Something we've both operated without for a long time." "Which is?" Emily looked at him. "Someone in the room who's actually in your corner," she said. "Not because they're paid to be, not because they're afraid not to be, because the work requires it and they chose it." The wind moved across the rooftop. Marcus looked out at the city. His city, in every practical sense that mattered. The place where he'd built something from nothing and held it together through 15 years of decisions that had cost more than he'd ever fully accounted for. He thought about the diner, the buzzing neon light. A woman who had answered a half-finished sentence with one word and then removed her apron and walked toward the door without looking back. He thought about everything that word had set in motion. One syllable. One decision made, apparently, in no time at all. He stood up from the chair, walked to the railing beside her, looked at the city for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. Not the gesture of a boss offering terms to someone beneath him. The gesture of one person recognizing another, clean, direct, without hierarchy built into it. Emily looked at his hand. Then she took it. They shook once, brief, certain, the kind of handshake that didn't need to be held long because what it represented wasn't going anywhere. "One condition," Marcus said. Emily raised an eyebrow. "You tell me the real reason you said okay before I finished the sentence?" She almost smiled. The almost smile that had been threatening to become a real one for 6 days. "Because you looked at me like I was going to say no," she said. "And I've never been able to resist proving an assumption wrong." Marcus looked at her for a moment, then, for the first time, completely, without reservation, he smiled. It changed his face entirely. Made him look briefly like someone who hadn't always been what he'd become. Someone who existed before the weight of it. Below them, New York continued its relentless, indifferent business. Above it, two people stood at the edge of something that had started as a joke and arrived through 6 days of survival and secrets and the slow, reluctant work of genuine understanding at something neither of them had planned for. Not a transaction, not a hierarchy, a partnership, built not on fear, not on leverage, not on the threat of what happened if you stepped out of line, but on the rarest currency in their world: mutual respect. She had walked into his life with nothing but a one-word answer and a 3-year plan. He had walked through his entire career certain that control was something you held alone. They were both wrong. And for the first time, both of them were glad about it.